This video is an exploration of a theology of work and looking at the link between our understanding of work, and I'm coming from a Christian perspective, so that's got to therefore be a theology of work, looking at the relationship between a theology of work and the impact that we as a species have on the environment. Now, our understanding of work profoundly shapes our understanding of value. Our understanding of work profoundly shapes what we think is worth doing with our time. Our understanding of work profoundly shapes other aspects of life, what we think it's worth owning. And closely related to our understanding of the concept of work is, for want of a better term, our relationship with the earth, hence an awareness of what terms to use here, our eco footprint, our green policies, our general environmental awareness. And so understanding work at a deep level is going to be an essential part of working out how we can live more in harmony with the constraints that the planet puts on us. Because so much of that relates to how we use the world, and so much of how we use the world is very closely related to our concept of work. There are a variety of various strands of history which feed into our modern Western view of work. Let's start in the ancient world. Let's look at a Greek and Roman culture, which has powerfully fed into our Western understanding. In Greek and Roman culture, those who had leisure, which were the movers and shapers, the people whose ideas very much come down to us, those people, great disdain of work. It wasn't so much the activities undertaken in that work, but it was that they were not freely chosen. And so the leisured classes, I mean, they might choose to do all sorts of things. They might choose to make things, but they didn't have to. And their view was that it was leisure which was this expression of a free human existence. Now, another major strand, possibly even bigger, feeding into Western culture and Western understanding is that Jewish and Christian tradition. Now, within that strand, you've got an acceptance of work as a calling and a blessing by God. And so work then becomes a source of human fulfillment. However, this idea developed in some, as far as I'm concerned, pretty unhelpful directions in the first millennium. Following Aristotle, Augustine, and then Aquinas, distinguished between two types of life. The first one is what's known as the active life. This covered almost every kind of work, and interestingly, it even included studying, preaching, and teaching. This active life is connected to the needs of the human body. This active life was seen as that which is shared with animals. The contrast then was with what was known as the contemplative life. This was meditation on God and his truth. It was oriented towards the eternal, and it was a life that was truly free. Now, while both of these lives were seen as having their place by people like Augustine and Aquinas, which then fed into the church and into society, both of these lives were seen as having their place. The life of contemplation was considered just simply better than the life of action. And this sort of distinction then just embedded itself within medieval Christianity and hence into the whole mindset of Western culture. And it resulted in the view that the calling, the true way of living as a Christian, the true vocation for a Christian was the monastic one. So the terms calling and vocation in that period just simply ended up referring to only one type of activity. A calling was something quite radically different to everyday work. Now this changed significantly in the 16th century with the Reformation. Almost without exception, the reformers just simply rejected that view that the contemplative life was more truly a Christian life. So the reformers taught that work, as well as leisure and contemplation, was a good gift of God. They maintained that all forms of work were of equal worth in the sight of God. This is one of the heresy charges for which William Tyndale was executed. And a quote from Tyndale: "There is no work better than another to please God. To pour water, to wash dishes, to be a cobbler or an apostle, all is one. To wash dishes and to preach is all one, as touching the deed to please God." Luther taught that God in his providence had put each person in their place in society to do the work of that place. Adam had work he was commanded to do. His was to plant the garden, cultivate and look after it. There's therefore nothing, as far as those reformers are concerned, which does not become spiritual when done in the Word of God and faith. As capitalism and the market economy developed on from the 16th century, this stress on work and calling continued. And we're in the territory here of Max Weber's thesis, which you may be familiar with, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. But in the process of that development, it became, this thinking about work again became detached from its Judeo-Christian roots, and it became focused pretty well entirely on production and money. As you got Benjamin Franklin then, he declared that time is money. And that captured the heart of this attitude. And of course, that's a phrase that you will hear very frequently today, particularly when you're at work. And so the essence of that thinking is that, well, real work is work that's paid. And so if you've got unpaid activity, that's not work. That's whatever it is. It's a hobby. It's just something you do in your spare time. And so you've got this idea that if it's not paid, then it's seriously downgraded in value. And so that meant that a major element of that was a huge amount of the work that women did was not really counted as work. Work then became this the sphere of what men did, and particularly what men did out of the home when they went to work. And what went on in the home, left behind after the men had gone to work, was in fact not really work. It might be classed as housework, but it's not paid, so it's not that important. And the economists generally just accepted and promoted that categorization, and then just proceeded on, and work got defined as its disutility. Work is only done for external reward. This really close linkage between work and money. And then with the development of capitalism, work devoted to the production of commodities has become the central activity of human life. In the 21st century, we have multiple layers of issues related to work and our understanding of it. Major aspect of this, as far as I'm concerned, is the increasing number of people who are deeply alienated from their work because it's essentially meaningless beyond the money it generates, in order that they can then buy consumer goods and leisure activities. You also get the profound paradox that they're working longer and longer hours to generate more and more money, so they can buy more and more of these luxuries, these consumer goods that they of course have very little time to actually use. Now, it's essential to avoid nostalgia in what I'm saying here. There's nothing particularly romantic about the work my grandparents did in the mills of Manchester in the Edwardian era when they first left school. It was long hours, it was dangerous conditions, and they didn't get paid much. But at the same time as avoiding the rose-tinted spectacles, it's also essential not to throw out babies with bathwater. Sorry, maybe too many metaphors there. My grandparents had something in their grueling mill work that a huge percentage of today's workers, I suspect, lack. They knew exactly what they were doing. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, they worked in a mill in the textile industry. They could see raw cotton arrive. They could see the woven cloth leave. And they would know that the clothes that many of the people were wearing, in some small way, were down to them. That a lot of the tailoring was done locally. So they knew that in some very small but very tangible way, and it's this linkage between what they were doing and seeing some tangible contribution, that they were somehow contributing pretty tangibly to the largest empire the world had ever known. They were embedded in a community. When I say community there, I mean, in its technical sense, the community that was face-to-face knowledge of people, multi-generational. They were embedded in this community. They worked together. These were the people who just all got up in the morning, left their front doors of their terraced houses along with everybody else, and then clattered off to work in their clogs to the local mills and factories. They worked together. They lived together. These were real communities. And even if you weren't in that, if you were in the finance sector in that era, then you could see pretty directly that what you were doing was serving those who were clearly making things which were tangible and ultimately the foundation of the economy. Now, in stark contrast to this, I want to look at a very typical example of today's work. And so I want to look at a niece of mine who works in the city, a big American finance house. And it's quite difficult when she explains to me what she does. It's kind of got to really pin this down. In contrast to what my grandparents did in their work, what my father did. My father worked in chemical engineering. He designed pipe work for sulfuric acid and polythene plants. So when you asked him what he did, he could show you photographs. You could go to D-side. I think some of the ones that he built were there. You could actually take you there and show the pipe work and say, well, that's my pipe work. I designed that. So this niece, she's a computer programmer. And she writes, I'm assuming these would be called algorithms. These routines that she writes are there to read financial reports. The point of these is they've got to write these reports absolutely super quick. So the report's published in digital format. Her routines read this super quick, understand it, and can then, in an automated way, in very, very quickly respond in the market. Okay, well, I've just got this suspicion. I mean, it might be beyond a suspicion. People working in the field may be able to clarify this or say, no, it's actually not true. I'd be interested in some feedback on that. But what I would be slightly concerned about is that actually what she's doing here, she's writing computer programs which are reading these reports, then that in some way responds to the market, which responds elsewhere in the market, which somehow generates a financial report somewhere, which her routines read. And it's difficult to see that this isn't just eventually a circle which just comes back to itself. And my concern in this is that the amount of contact with what I want to call reality is actually rather tenuous. At some point, it strikes me that this data on these computers, in these big finance houses. At some point, surely it's got to touch reality. Well, what do I mean by reality? Well, reality is stuff which it's there whether people believe in it or not. And so things like potatoes in a field, copper ore, a car, and a huge amount of the UK economy seems at the moment to hover somewhere well above this layer of the solid and the real. A huge amount of current work and our economy appears to be based essentially on supporting itself, simply keeping going the group of people living in a particular area. Now, fairly obviously, when you stick 20, 30,000 people upwards into a particular area, then that just in itself generates lots of things that are needed. Education, you've got to build schools, you've got healthcare, you've got the retail sector, hairdressers, plumbers, legal and financial services, etc. Now, obviously, some of that is fairly tangible. The food sold in Tesco's, the boilers fitted by the plumbers, the equipment used by the hairdressers, that's all tangible, that's all real stuff. And it's the result of manufacture, of industry, of agriculture. However, in 21st century Britain, this tangible element is only around 25% of the UK economy. The finance and service sector now, in contrast to the Edwardian equivalent that I referenced earlier, it appears to be largely serving and financing itself. Now, this is really the area that I'm really interested in exploring, and I'm exploring it by asking questions about it. I'm a long way from being an expert in this, but this looks worryingly like just pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. There is almost certainly a strong correlation between the satisfaction we gain from work and the immediacy and understandability of it. Some fairly obvious examples there are sort of primal examples. You plant a seed, you tend the crop, you then eat the result. The family lives. Or another one, you chop down a tree, you cut them into sections, you build a house, you use the offcuts then for furniture or fuel, and the family's sheltered, warm and can cook. Now, this is working the world, a phrase from that creation story in Genesis, where God put the man in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. So what we've got here, this is working the world at its most primal. It's what's built into us at a genetic level as Homo sapiens. It traces back to pre-sapient hominids who've been making things for millions of years. Now, the further we move from that which is built into us at a genetic level, the more alienation we're likely to experience. Now, at some point during the late 20th century, much technology moved to a point where manufacture consisted to a large extent simply of what I'm expressing as assembly of black boxes. In other words, you've got all these components, the function of which is known, but the inner workings and exactly how that function's achieved is just completely opaque to us. So a lot of manufacture now consists of the assembly of these black boxes in order to then produce the finished product. Now, it's a tiny proportion of highly skilled experts who understand those individual components within that. And it's entirely plausible that, in fact, there's nobody who really understands the totality of the product, just the individual bit that they are experts in. A stark contrast to the past. I mean, when I was a boy, my mother, she'd been a wireless operator in World War II, and she could, when the radio or the TV was misbehaving, which in those days they did fairly frequently, she could just open the back and then persuade the valves to work again. And so she could. When I was, again, as a boy, I had one of those Philips electrical engineer sets for Christmas. I played around with that for a bit. Later on, moving on to a bit more sort of real world stuff, I built a fuzz box for my guitar, and I did that just by simply buying a book with electronics projects in it, and then just buying all the individual components, soldering them all together, and remarkably, it actually worked. I used to own a mid-60s Vox AC30, and when I looked at the innards of that, I could do some very basic things with valves, but I looked at the rest of the innards of it, and it was all clearly identifiable electronic components, and I was pretty confident that if I bothered to put the work in, I could understand it and would be able to repair it. Electronics was never particularly my thing. But the crucial thing is that in that period, even electronics was something where the skilled amateur, the interested home tech, was quite capable of having a pretty deep understanding of the technology that we were using. Now, those days are long gone. Repair of repair of digital equipment now is very specialist. So gone are the days of being able to clearly see the individual components on a circuit board, open up an iPhone, that's assuming you can even manage to get into it, and the chances of understanding anything you see inside is pretty close to zero. Looking at motorbikes, which is a particular theme of this channel, my 2009 Moto Guzzi 750 has, in my opinion, pretty atrocious fuel consumption and performance. However, I've worked out that to tweak this and give the required improvements, I've got to, well, actually, no, I can't. Someone is going to have to remap the ECU. I mean, in the past, it would have just been sort of reject the carbs, adjust the timing by moving the back plates, carrying the points. Yeah, that's all pretty straightforward stuff. I can do all that. But remapping the ECU, that's outside my capability. And it's not just outside my capability. Moto Guzzi are not a sort of mainstream make. And so far, I've been sort of half-heartedly exploring this for about 12 months. And I've yet to find a way of getting access to somebody who can actually plug in their computer to my ECU and do the required remapping. So we're now in a position, increasingly in a position, where we own and use equipment we have no real chance of understanding. What I'm sitting in front of to make this video, I'm pretty clueless as to what is going on inside it, and the chances are the equipment that you're listening to this video on and watching it, again, I'm going to take a guess that the majority of the people watching this video, again, are pretty clueless about how the kit works that is delivering the sound and images to them. So we're in a position now where we are completely alienated from all our technology. We live in a world of black boxes, which we really have little or no hope to keep working. If they go wrong, our lives increasingly depend on them. And so when they cease to function, what realistic options are there? Well, realistic option is you stick it in a drawer. I don't quite sure why we do that, but that's what we usually do because we can't bring ourselves to throw it away, and then just buy a replacement. Now, of course, when those electronic gadgets eventually do end up going to recycling, well, what do you mean by recycling? Very complicated. I don't want to go into that in too much detail now, but the main thing is don't think something has been recycled just because you put it into a recycling bin. We are very much alienated from the products that we depend on, and those products we have a suspicion at the back of our minds, which I desperately want to put to the front of people's minds, those products that we depend on are potentially profoundly damaging to the environment in which we live. So returning to the theological aspect rather than just the that preamble, which was about the ecological and the technical. I think that really discovering and applying a thoroughly biblical understanding of work is a route to a greater sense of well-being in the population. Also, it's a far more sustainable way of using the resources of the earth. But importantly, this is where I would part company with Extinction Rebellion, who seem to be focused predominantly on just looking after the world and seem to be completely ignoring all the great value of technology that has been generated by good work, well, some of it by possibly fairly bad work, but we've all benefited from lots of this. So what I think a biblical theology of work is yes, use the resources of the earth. It's really getting what I think was there in the past, which is a fundamental value of work, whether paid or not. Recovering this idea of calling, that we're using our God-given abilities in the service of others to glorify God, potentially in whatever we do, which might be working as a plumber, might be working as a chemical engineer, it might be working as a gardener, it might be doing the washing, it might be bringing up children, it might be caring for elderly relatives at home. So really grasping that idea of the fundamental value of work, which is present, deeply embedded within the Judeo-Christian tradition, but at certain periods of history has been lost. Really getting hold of this idea that creation mandate from Genesis, from the Genesis creation story, when the man was put in the garden to work it and take care of it. It's not a sort of a sacred garden with some Mother Earth goddess where you're not allowed to do anything other than hug the trees. No, it's supposed to work the garden. That includes digging out the iron ore, turning it into steel, digging out the coal, but not trashing the garden in the process. So working the world and taking care of it. And that's an essential component in our theology of work. And also a very important part of the theology of work from the Judeo-Christian tradition is the idea of Sabbath, that there is actually more to life than work. And so therefore there's one day a week when you try and do as little work as possible. And you spend the time then resting and relaxing with family and friends, restoring restorative activity. And for those for whom it's appropriate, that's also a good day to be able to meet together with others to worship. But even without that overtly Christian or Jewish element to it, just the break when you know that you are reminded there's something more important than your paid work would do us all a great deal of good. Now, in practical terms, I suggest that this would mean a greater emphasis on making things of quality, building to last. Going back to bikes again, I've got two motorbikes at the moment. One is a 2009 Moto Guzzi and the other is a 1939 Velocette 500 MSS. One of the things I could be pretty confident of is that my 2009 Moto Guzzi, there's absolutely no way that will still be on the road and functioning when it's 80 years old. It's just not built of quality that will last that long. The Velocette most definitely is beautifully engineered motorcycle. So building to last, building with the expectation of repair, and returning to that period of, I'm guessing it's around the turn of the millennium, prior to that, when much of our technology could be repaired by the competent DIYer. And if the competent DIYer couldn't do it, you'd be able to find some local tradesmen on the high street who would be able to do it for you. Now, of course, this is going to impact enormously on the economy. To shift production from China to UK to go to a build to last rather than a built-in obsolescence and throw away, that's going to require massive rethinking of prices and wages. It's going to be turning a supertanker. It's certainly going to take a long time. But the difficulty of the task shouldn't stop us making first steps in that direction. Now, I'm making this video just as we're emerging from COVID-19 lockdown in 2020. I need to say the first one, because of course there might be several more lockdowns as we go through 2020 and into 21. Anyway, this is moving out of the first one. And it's fairly obvious that there's huge rethinking going to have to be done in many areas of life, many areas of work going to have to be rethought drastically in this working out what it's like to live in a COVID-19 world. And so this is an ideal time to radically rethink how we can bring manufacturing, bring industry back into the nation states, how we can look at recovering a sense of value in work, and how we can then ensure that a good understanding of work, and I think this Judeo-Christian theology of work is potentially a really valuable contribution to that discussion.